Now, everything that we've talked about is like kind of retirement sources that have just been yourself, like kind of the math of retiring. But in reality, there are a number of programs that are out there to help you in some way during retirement. Now, the big three sources are: one, your own savings; two, government transfer payments, or essentially the government taxes one person and then hands it to you in the form of, say, Medicare or Social Security; and finally, corporate or government pension plans. So why do we focus so much time on our own savings and our own behavior? Well, this is the thing that you actually have control over. You have the most control over yourself and your decisions. I mean, you don't control government solvency or corporate and government pension solvency. Those things are outside of your control, so that's not what we should be spending most of our time and effort and worrying on. You have the most control over your revenue, your expenses, and your investments. Now, that doesn't mean you know exactly how much investment returns are going to be, but you can make adjustments over time. You're focusing on what you control. Now, a quick term check. Go through the items before, but understanding the terms defined benefit and defined contribution, it's very important because they're very different from each other. Defined benefit is how much you receive when you retire will be $500 a month. And you're just told what that benefit is. A defined contribution is, okay, I am going to put X amount of dollars in your account on behalf of you, and whatever that money is when you retire, that's what it is. So the practical difference between these is who assumes the risk when things go poorly or not go as well as you'd hope. In defined benefit, the organization is assuming the risk, and in defined contribution, you are assuming the risk. Now, with corporate and government pensions, primarily state or county or local government pensions, many of them will pay out at 100%. If they promise you the money, they will pay it. But a lot of them aren't probably going to pay out what they are promising. And this is really complicated. There's a lot of politics involved. But I mean, the reality of the situation is that the majority of the states within the United States have underfunded their pensions. Many of the municipalities, some of them severely so. And there are very few companies that corporate pensions that are left out there that have kept their pensions over time. It's just been too risky to be involved with this, and they've shifted over from defined benefit to defined contribution. So the problem is that these companies, they've either gone bankrupt, perhaps partly due to their pension system, or they've gotten rid of those pensions. So don't assume you're going to get exactly 100% of everything that's promised within a corporate or government pension. It's likely that it will be 100% or perhaps high, but if you assume that is your check to get out of here, that might not materialize as you're hoping. Now, you might be thinking, isn't there something that can be done about this? Well, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation exists for these corporate pensions, for example, and they're supposed to guarantee your pension if, say, the corporation goes bankrupt or they can't pay for some reason. But unfortunately, the long-term, from the General Accountability Office of the government, the PBGC's long-term financial future remains tenuous, just because kind of all of the remaining pensions that are out there are kind of all in a bad boat together. So there is a real possibility that they'll pay out at less than the 100% promised amount. Now, Bloomberg, for the last few years, has been tracking and ranking states as far as government pension funding. And there are some states that have not set aside enough money in order to fund their pensions. And so states like Kentucky, New Jersey, Illinois, that have really run into some major struggles coming up with the savings and setting aside that money for those pensions. Now, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. There are some states that have actually adjusted their funding very, very well as far as their pensions are concerned. Wisconsin is frequently held up as a model of how to fund pensions properly. And we're not going to go into the details of that now, but quite interesting on how a state can actually implement a fully funded pension program. So let's transition to a Social Security program in the United States and similar programs in other countries. And in order for the system to really work without a drastic change, there's certain assumptions that need to happen. First, you need pretty stable birth rates so that the population continues to grow slightly. You need the economy to continue to grow, and you need a stable amount of work length and retirement length. And all three of these assumptions are currently an issue. The first is with birth rates. Birth rates have fallen dramatically across basically every developed country in the world. And this isn't, I'm not here to make commentary as far as, that good or bad, but just about its impact on pensions or government pay-go systems. So in many places, it's well below replacement. And so median age in, say, Japan, Germany, South Korea, Italy, Greece, the median age, or the kind of the middle age, in all those countries, it's above 40 years old. So that's, there are just as many people above 40 years old as there are under 40 years old, which is quite interesting. Again, some think this is, good for the environment or global warming. That's not the focus that we are putting on this. This is just within the lens of personal finance. But almost every nation's program is to transfer money to the elderly and doesn't really have any savings or investment behind it. Countries like Sweden and Chile and a few other countries are notable exceptions. But for the most part, in order to transfer money to the elderly, you have to have children to tax. So in order to tax children, if you don't have any kids, there's no program, there's nobody to tax to transfer that to the elderly. And the United States is no exception. The United States birth rate has been consistently falling over time. So the first part of birth rates, those have been falling. The second is life expectancy. So with medical innovations and life extensions, yay, that's a good thing. But as far as, again, this isn't to say that increasing life expectancy is bad, but for the solvency of pension programs, that means you're giving money for longer, and that can drive insolvency. So kind of not so yay. So if you think about this, if you work for a total of 30 years during your life and you live until you're 90, then you would spend 60 years of your life depending on your savings or other people to provide for you. So work 30 years, depend on others for 60 years. And so those 30 years of work need to be really productive for this model to work. So I believe this is the best stick figure in a government report that I've ever seen when I picked this up. I found it pretty entertaining. Anyway, so this is the number of dependents are at the top and the number of people who are supporting them are at the bottom. So in 1960, in the United States, there were 5 people working and paying into Social Security for every 1 person that was receiving. And in 2009, it's more like 3 for every 1 receiving. And by 2030, it's going to be closer to 2 receiving. And so that's basically the point of this, is that that burden gets heavier because you need to tax more from those people in order to fund the current benefits. On top of this, countries with high median ages, older countries, they tend to have lower economic growth. It's in a way the opposite of this concept called the demographic dividend. And the easiest way to explain it is if you imagine 100 people on an island and 60 people are picking bananas and they're helping provide for all 100, but then you go from 60 people picking bananas to 45 people picking bananas, you're not going to have as many bananas. So when a higher percentage of your population isn't working, that's kind of the situation that you end up in. Now, we can avoid this. We could avoid this as far as a pension problem is concerned if perhaps people who are 55 and older decide to work longer or more of their lives. There's some sign that this is happening, and it's kind of unknown right now if that's going to continue to increase or how that trend is going to change in the future. Now, one final bit on work length and retirement length is that as people have gone through college, and a lot of people have been taking breaks from work, what you see is lower labor force participation, especially from males, and this trend to start careers perhaps a little bit later in life, which it means fewer years working. And so also the number of people on disability in the United States has grown a lot since 2008, and the disability program is part of the overall Social Security program. So all in all, the standard retirement age from the government, it has shifted upward a little bit over the last 30 years. So instead of retiring at 65, the government's been trying to lift that number a little bit, but this is not enough to compensate for this kind of lower births, higher life expectancy, and lower projected economic growth. So you might be asking yourself, why are we studying demographics? And what I'm trying to communicate here is this isn't just like a political issue that you could just easily resolve if we just get some smart people in the same room, and we could just fix the problem if we do X, Y, Z. And you hear politicians promise this, or there will be no negative consequences if we just do this quick fix. In reality, it's a very complicated problem, and there's no silver bullet to solve this. And this window of opportunity to adjust the Social Security program in a very politically viable way has been slowly shutting. And there's not much runway left to do this in a more gentle way. The longer the wait, the more drastic it's going to be. And also the same math applies to the Medicare program as well, but it's a lot easier to explain Social Security. So we've just covered Social Security, but it's kind of the same problem for both Medicare and Social Security. You also see this same type of math applying not just the United States, but also all these other developing nations like Italy and Japan and these older nations. So why am I bringing this up? Well, you might not receive exactly 100% of the benefits that have been promised to you, especially if you're born after the year, say, 1975. Now, I'm not trying to be a downer here. What I'm trying to communicate is you should focus on what you can control, and you can't just 100% depend on these other sources. Now, the other sources will be great, and the percentage that you do receive, maybe it's 80% or 90% or 70 or 100, maybe if you're lucky 100. But in the end, what you can control is your own retirement planning for yourself, what you can control. Now, I've included a lot of great resources below, super important to go through those. But really quickly, as far as an IRA, this is an individual retirement account. And it's this tax preferred account. It's a great vehicle for saving for retirement. And the max contribution that you can put in it changes, it adjusts for inflation. As of 2019, it was $6,000 for those under 50 and $7,000 for those over 50. Now, the reason why people do this is that there's a tax advantage through this. It is this deferral method. And so what happens is that, say you contribute, the $6,000, you're 40 years old and you contribute $6,000 in your IRA. Well, what happens is that $6,000 gets deducted, it's a tax deduction from your current tax year. So you don't get taxed on that income. Well, fantastic. Well, that goes into this IRA, and you're only going to be taxed on it when you withdraw it X numbers into the future. Now, what if you want your money now? Well, if you want it before you turn 59 and a half years of age, there's going to be a 10% penalty, and there's going to be taxes as well. So if you're putting your money into a traditional IRA, one big reason why you shouldn't be tapping it is this big penalty. So if you need that little investment banker in your soul saying, don't touch that money, a traditional IRA is a good vehicle for it. Now, a Roth IRA is kind of like the opposite of a traditional IRA. So you still get taxed on the income that you make this year and put into your Roth IRA, but all of the growth that comes out of it when you withdraw it in the future, that is not taxed. So there are income limitations to this. So in 2019, for those who are single, it was $120,000, and for married, it was $193,000. So essentially, you're taxed now, but all of those increases are not taxed at all. So we'll walk through a couple examples for when a Roth versus a traditional IRA perhaps should be considered or preferred. Now, with the Roth IRA, what if you need to access your money in that Roth IRA? Well, before we learned within a traditional IRA, you're penalized for it. But with a Roth IRA, you can actually pull it out without any penalty or tax whatsoever, as long as it's the principal amount, not the earnings. If you're over 59 and a half, then if it's been there for more than 5 years, no problem. And if it's under 5 years, then you're taxed, but there's no penalty. So those aspects with Roth IRA are really convenient. Now, what if you are under 59 and a half? Let's just step back from this situation. Why are you accessing your IRA, whether it's traditional or Roth or for whatever it is? There are certain things like home purchases or medical bills which you might be considering tapping it, but remember, like, this is something that if you go into bankruptcy, generally your IRA is protected, and that's not what goes away. But as soon as you pull that money out, it's no longer protected from bankruptcy. So unless you really know what you're doing, really need the money, and you've come up with a plan that makes a lot of sense for your specific situation, it's usually best to just leave your IRA where it is. But again, depends on the circumstances. Just do your homework and figure out what aligns with your goals. Now, traditional versus Roth, you can only contribute $6,000, say, to an IRA per year. So which one is better? Well, the traditional IRA can be better if you're, say, in a high tax bracket today. It'll be in a lower one in the future. Could make a lot of sense. Also, traditional IRAs can be better if you need that central banker of the soul to say, don't pull out that money. So in these cases, traditional IRA can be very, very good. Now, there's a reason why many financial professionals have a slight bias toward Roth, but of course it depends on the specific circumstances. So some will recommend it because they believe that tax rates will go up in the future because of problems that we've discussed previously. And another reason for it is kind of the psychological effect. So there's no complex math of like, okay, I've saved $50,000 in this IRA, but the government will take a certain percentage, and so the after-tax value, you don't have to think through all of that. And so it can psychologically encourage you to save more, because you can say, I have $50,000 saved, not I have $60,000 saved, and then I'm going to deduct $10,000, and then so I actually only have $50,000 saved. So this complexity, the psychological effects should not be minimized. Some of the other benefits is kind of there's this greater flexibility of a tax penalty if you end up working while you're older, which is pretty complex. Probably shouldn't be a major part of the calculation. But finally, if you need the money with a Roth IRA in some type of situation where it makes sense to tap into your IRA, in the very few circumstances where that makes sense, you can pull out the principal without any penalty or without the taxes. So a 401k, you've probably heard this before. A 401k, it's basically just like an IRA, except it's set up by your employer. And there are certain restrictions and lots of fine print there. Some more details below. And if you are considering, a 401k at your current employer, there's kind of some homework to do associated with that. But one of the benefits of this 401k is that you have a much higher limit than your IRA. So the maximum annual employee contribution is $19,000 for those under 50, $25,000 for those over 50. So that's a pretty hefty amount. And the maximum annual total contribution is $56,000 a year. So your employer could actually stick a lot into an account like that. So that's like, you can pack a lot more in there than say $6,000. So if you are earning quite a bit, you could actually put quite a bit of your earnings into these preferential retirement tax accounts. So then we get to 401k matching. What is 401k matching? It's basically free money. When people offer you free money, you say yes to free money. There are very few circumstances where it would make sense to not do 401k matching. Very few. My favorite illustration of this is I was once working on a project in Singapore, and I was with my boss. And it was the very end of this project, and we walked into this hotel, and we were dressed, nice from work, and we walked into this hotel. And this woman turned to us as we walked in. She turned to my boss and said, "Are you here for the party?" And without stopping, my boss turned to her and said, "Yes, we are." And as we're walking forward, I said, "What are you doing? Like, we're not here for a party." He said, "Always say, when someone asks you, are you here for the party, you always say yes." Anyway, crazy party on some helipad in Singapore. But the point of all of this story is that you say yes to free money. So if you contribute to your retirement, your employer will match a certain percentage of what you contribute, and you should at least kind of max out that contribution. For example, let's say your employer matches 50% of contributions up to 10% of your salary, and you make $100,000. So if you put $10,000 in your 401k, then the employer will instantly put $5,000 in. That's pretty fantastic. Now, another example. Employer matches 60% of contributions up to 5% of your salary, and you make $100,000. Let's see if you can figure that one out, and then we'll move on. Now, it's kind of the only catch with 401ks are the fees, and lots of companies have 401ks, but the fees can be much higher than, say, the normal index funds. So, like in my case, what I found at some of my employers where I've worked is that I could select certain funds to invest in that had very reasonable fees, but I had to do a little bit of homework first to find, like, okay, you can invest in one of these 30 funds, and maybe 4 or 5 of them were actually really attractive given the expense ratios and what they were investing in. So as far as taking advantage of that match, make sure you match it as much as you can. And if there is no matching, generally, most of the time it's more convenient to max out your individual IRA first instead of your 401k contribution, just for the convenience of it. But if you've already maxed out your individual IRA, if there's no matching, you can still take advantage of the 401k match. Now, let's say you're approaching retirement, you have a mix of, say, Roth IRA and maybe traditional 401k. So you have this mix of taxable and non-taxable accounts. At 70.5 years of age, you will start getting taxed on a chunk of your taxable accounts. It could basically force you for these traditional 401ks and for traditional IRAs. And really what you need to do is kind of sit down when you're kind of in your late 50s and sit down with a really good, tax planning advisor and really do the math to break out how much you should be pulling out of each account every year in order to minimize your tax liabilities. I mean, it's pretty complicated work, and it pays to contract a really good tax professional to help you do that. Now, for retirement accounts, what have I seen successful people do with their retirement accounts? And for many people, this is the basic approach. First, you establish an emergency fund. I mean, that's the first step to any automation. You have to have that emergency fund. Otherwise, it's really difficult to automate all of the rest of these things in your life. The second is to max out whatever matching is provided by your employer. Say yes to free money. The third is to automate. So you max out the Roth IRA to the extent that you can, assuming you can hit the $6,000 limit. From there, push any excess savings into paying off, say, student loans, and determine if your 401k funds have reasonable fees. Assuming they have reasonable fees, most do, or you can find the right funds within them that do. You can calculate the right contribution given your spending level. And finally, you don't want to put all of your savings into retirement accounts. I mean, maybe you don't want to push all the way down into step 3 or step 4 or step 5. Because, say, you're trying to save money for a house or, build up a bigger emergency fund, or maybe you're saving up for a car. And so you don't want to put all of these savings into retirement accounts, especially non-Roth retirement accounts. You don't want to restrict yourself going forward. Now, also, from what I've seen others do, is kind of full gaming mode for kind of these upper middle class households where you have a joint income of $120,000 a year, where one of the spouses was making, say, $70,000 and the other $50,000. What I've seen couples in that situation do, as I've talked to them, is they'll spend around, say, $50,000 a year, and they max out all of their matching options for both spouses, if a 401k is available for both of them, assuming. And they've also set aside this emergency fund. And a lot of the time, people in this situation, they don't want a huge hassle. It's not worth it to them to have a small, emergency fund. If you have a larger one, then it just lowers the stress level. They'll also get to the point, and remember, we're talking about, years and years. This isn't a couple that's, 21 years old. Okay, back to it. So they set aside, short-term savings for, say, a car or a house down payment, etc. They also max out all of their Roth options for both spouses. And so if one of them, if they have access to, say, 401k plans or also 403b plans, they kind of max that out to the extent possible as well. And as they go through this, they can potentially retire in 15 years and kind of like what we've discussed previously. I mean, in reality, they don't retire in 15 years, and they just kind of adjust their expenses according to whatever their goals happen to be. And they achieve a certain level of kind of financial freedom to kind of do what they want. Now, what I've just described is what some people choose to do, and then you hit reality. I mean, sometimes you could be single, could be only one spouse is working, you could be in a different place, or you have different goals in your life, and that's fine. But the key here is to recognize the different options that are available for you, recognize the certain vehicles that are available for you to help you, save, and channel your financial resources to help you achieve those goals. And so this isn't like we're sitting down and prescribing every single step that you should be doing, but as we've walked through the retirement math and the retirement accounts, you should be able to internalize this and understand what's available and what are the advantages of each one of these vehicles. So what happens when we hit panic mode? Or as people joke, your 401k turns into a 201k. Ah, ha, ha, ha. Except that joke's not funny when it actually happens. Don't panic. In large friendly letters, just like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy informs you. So stay calm, play the long game, let the index funds do their thing, tweak your medium and long-term plans, but panicking and just pulling completely out of the market historically has been a really bad decision, and just the patient waiting game has eventually paid off every single time in the past. And for fun, if you're interested, there's this John Oliver episode. I've included a link for it below. But if you just start it at minute 18 and move your way forward, it's actually shockingly good, really, really great retirement advice. So from minute 18 forward, if you want to watch the entire episode, if that's your thing and you like that, great. But if you'd like to, it's an entertaining and educational way to explain retirement.